All right, great. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you guys all here for being here today. Thanks for sticking around for the last talk. I'm going to talk about some of my work and some of the work that the Peyton Lab does in the Elkhorn Slough and around California, working on salt marshes as a blue carbon sequestration method and a nature-based solution for climate change. So this is the Peyton Biogeochemistry Lab. We're based out of UC Santa Cruz. We're a pretty big lab. We've got 9 graduate students working on a lot of different facets of biogeochemistry, both paleoceanography and contemporary biogeochemistry. I'm part of the Wetlands project, which the majority of us work on, but there's also projects on coral reef, ocean acidification, microplastics in the atmosphere, microplastics in the ocean, microplastics in Tahoe. We have other projects going on looking at biochar, looking at the effects of the Vistra battery plant fire. So we're a pretty diverse lab, but I'll talk about some of our more local work today. Just a little bit about me. I'm a second-year PhD student. I personally study lateral carbon fluxes, mostly in the Elkhorn Slough, and I study blue carbon ecosystems in general and their carbon sequestration potential. I'm originally from Washington, D.C., and some of my background before this was working in sea level rise ecology and as a botanist on the East Coast. Just a quick overview. I'll talk about some of the motivations and needs behind this project, then some definitions and background, examples of work in California in general, and then the Elkhorn Slough Carbon Project that our team works on. So, as most of you are probably familiar, to limit global warming, greenhouse gas emissions must decline by 7.6% per year in order to cap warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is the limit that was agreed on by the Paris Agreement because of the catastrophic ecological effects that are anticipated after 1.5 and particularly after 2 degrees of warming. Some things like 8% of plants losing half their habitable area, 6% of insect deaths at 1.5%, and 70 to 90% of decline in coral reefs. So this is an agreement that happened in Paris in 2015. We recently pulled out of it, but it is now 136 countries that have committed to reaching carbon neutrality by the second half of the 21st century. So far, only 2 countries have achieved this goal, and most countries are not on track to achieve their goal by 2050. So even if the world were to aggressively electrify cars, buildings, and create increasing clean energy to power everything, there's still going to be residual emissions in the atmosphere. So there will still be carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that we've emitted into the atmosphere that will stick around long after we take away industries that continue to create them. And there are also industries that can't readily be decarbonized. So there will be some degree of greenhouse gas production, no matter how clean of an economy that we can create. So beyond the fact that most countries do not seem to be, are likely not going to reach their carbon neutrality goal, we are going to continue to create these emissions. And so just emissions abatement, just preventing emissions, is not going to be enough to reach carbon neutrality. So this graph shows what we would need to do that to get to full decarbonization. So if we were just to decarbonize, to reduce our emissions and stop pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we would get to this gray line over here. But we need to be at 0. So in order to reach 0, we need to employ emissions. We need to deploy neutralization strategies and address the residual emissions that are still in the atmosphere to achieve carbon dioxide removal. So carbon dioxide removal is the process of taking CO2 that is in the atmosphere and storing it in soils, plants, the ocean, rocks, all within Earth's crust. So taking existing CO2 that is in the atmosphere and putting it into a carbon stable form where it can't cause climate change. So this can look like a lot of different things. Soil carbon, so plants when they photosynthesize take up carbon and they store it in their tissue. Same with forests when they do that. And so the longer your ecosystem lives, which is why things like tropical forests are really effective at this, because you have really long-lived tree species that can store this carbon for an extremely long time. There's technological strategies that we can take in, so biomass capture, carbon capture technologies, which directly pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and make it carbon stable, or they pump it into geologic formations where they can store it under the ground for a long time, and that would be direct CO2 capture. Accelerated chemical weathering of rocks is a strategy, but the one that I'll talk about today is coastal blue carbon, and that would be to engage our existing ecosystems that already do this naturally and see how we can protect them, make it more effective, and restore habitats that have been degraded. So this is what we call nature-based solutions, which is any action that protects, sustainably manages, or restores natural ecosystems in order to fight climate change. This often comes with co-benefits for human health, water security, disaster risk reduction, and it brings a lot of benefits in terms of human well-being and biodiversity to restore these ecosystems. So this looks like protecting intact lands that are working towards carbon sequestration, managing working lands to be more effective at this, and to restore degraded lands so that they can bring back some of these ecosystem services that they might have lost. So this is a quote from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. By working with nature, we have the potential to reduce emissions by more than a third of what is needed by 2030. Without nature, we will not be able to achieve the 1.5 or net zero emissions by 2050, and we will not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So it is critical that we engage with our current ecosystems to bring about the goal of climate neutrality, but they also have a lot of co-benefits. So the big one is that these other technologies that I talked about earlier, direct air capture or geologic storage of carbon dioxide, are often not shovel ready. They're going to involve extreme technological advancement, or they have other negative side effects. Maybe you are capturing a lot of CO2 with your direct air capture, but you're likely also producing a lot of CO2 in building a facility that large to affect this on a scale. Nature-based solutions don't have those negative side effects. They are also shovel-ready. We know how to restore ecosystems. We know what these baselines look like. They are relatively much more affordable. And like I said, they have a lot of co-benefits. So if you are restoring a mountain or forested watershed, you are not just sequestering carbon, but you are also reducing the potential for landslides, reducing soil loss, reducing the effects of extreme rainfall or flooding. Same with rivers or wetlands, they have a lot of co-benefits in terms of supporting biodiversity and also preventing storms, preventing flooding. If you were to green an urban space, you would sequester carbon, and you would also decrease urban heat stress and therefore decrease people's air conditioning usage. So these ecosystems have a lot to give us, and we have by and large degraded them. So nature can reduce more than 1/3 of emissions to meet this goal if countries are willing to invest in protecting and restoring their natural and working lands. Is anyone familiar with the concept of blue carbon? So blue carbon refers to the carbon that is stored by the ocean. And the vast majority of this, nearly half of the total ocean carbon, is stored in just 3 ecosystems: mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes. So the open ocean can absorb a lot of carbon, but it doesn't have a ton of photosynthesis because, for the most part, you don't have enough light availability throughout the whole ocean to generate enough vegetation growth. But these coastal ecosystems that take up about 2% of the Earth's surface are highly productive. They produce a lot of vegetation every year. And then as that vegetation dies, unlike a terrestrial ecosystem where it would be decomposed quickly and converted right back to CO2, which on the timescale of climate change is not a very effective strategy, they fall into these soils that have salty water almost continuously over them, and that lack of oxygen creates conditions that don't allow for decomposition. So where a plant that dies on a terrestrial ecosystem would fall to the forest floor, be decomposed, and go back to CO2, these will fall into these really carbon-rich, muddy sediments, and they will just stay like that, forming these super organic-rich soils that can be carbon sinks for thousands and thousands of years. So when we talk about carbon in these ecosystems, I think about it in terms of vertical fluxes, so that would be the CO2 in the atmosphere, both being drawn down by plants through photosynthesis, some of it being respirated back and going out into the atmosphere, soil carbon burial, so as plants decompose and they fall into the soil, you have carbon that is buried in the long term, and then lateral carbon movement, which is my personal research, which is the movement of carbon from these soils out into the ocean and back, where it might be trapped by these ecosystems or it might be lost into the ocean. So to give you a sense of how effective these ecosystems are, this is how much carbon a wetland stores in its soils compared to highly productive terrestrial ecosystems. Wetlands are very, very effective at storing carbon, and like I said earlier, this accounts for nearly half of the total ocean carbon in just these 3 ecosystems. So this is where you might find any of these. Here in California, we have seagrasses, kelp forests, and salt marsh. And so I'll talk about some of the work that we do in salt marshes today, because the global carbon sequestration potential of these ecosystems is extremely high in California. So we have a lot of potential to manage these ecosystems or restore degraded ecosystems in a way that could have a lot of co-benefits. So wetland restoration is a great way to mitigate climate change, but in order to do this and in order to understand how well these ecosystems are working, we need to have really high quality greenhouse gas measurements to capture the full carbon budget. And because these ecosystems, although they store a lot of carbon, also do produce some greenhouse gases. They produce methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. They produce some carbon dioxide. And our modeling right now is not effective enough to tell you what these ecosystems might do if you were to restore them. And to give you a sense of how variable it can be, these are some greenhouse gas emissions or the carbon dioxide emissions from Bay Area wetlands. So if it falls below the 0, that means it's sequestering carbon. And if it's above the 0, it means it's emitting carbon. So these wetlands in the Bay Area are highly degraded. The more salt water generally that you have, if you're converting to a mudflat, you have less vegetation, and therefore you're less effective at sequestering carbon. So these ecosystems can look like a lot of different things. Some of them are salt ponds, some of them are highly degraded. You can see some of them on the bottom: Twitchell corn, Sherman pasture, Twitchell alfalfa. They're wetland ecosystems because these agricultural species require a lot of water and they're traditionally wetlands, but these agricultural ecosystems produce a lot more carbon than the restored ones that are more on the left side. Sherman, East End, Mayberry are sequestering a lot of carbon. And there's a lot of work being done in the Bay to convert these agricultural areas or these degraded areas or the salt ponds back into sustainable wetlands. But even in the ones that are sequestering carbon, you can see that there's a lot of variability in the amount that they sequester. And so this can be really unpredictable, and they can vary a lot throughout a year, throughout a season. It can depend on rainfall, which can be very variable in California. And some of these represent wetlands that are right next to each other, and they are reacting very differently. But it's predicted that tidal marsh restoration in the Bay Area could remove 1 to 5 million metric tons of CO2 per year. So California is doing a lot of work to aggressively protect nature, to conserve and restore these nature-based climate solutions. California's wetlands were, up until quite recently, some of the most degraded in the world and definitely in the country. We lost something like 92% of our original wetlands that existed in California, and so restoring these ecosystems has a lot of potential. So most of you are probably familiar with California's 30 by 30 to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030 through conservation of lands and coastal waters, collaborative action, with a lot of goals to conserve and restore biodiversity, expand access to nature, and mitigate and build resilience to climate change. And so these are some of the nature-based acreage targets for what California aims to achieve by the year 2030. And this is kind of that same slide that I showed you earlier with what our current plan is doing, but what we need in the green is the further emissions reductions by active carbon dioxide removal that could be done through nature-based solutions. So to that end, moving on to some of the examples from work in California and some of the work that our lab does, motivated by the huge potential of these ecosystems to restore carbon and the co-benefits, we launched a study that is a collaboration between a lot of different UCs, national labs, and partners like the Elkhorn Slough or the San Francisco Estuary Institute are all involved in this, aiming to understand all of the different functions of wetlands, both in terms of its ecosystem services that are more traditionally associated with it, like food and nurseries, and sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Flood protection, but also its characteristics to understand the physical properties that can drive some of these changes and understand the underlying factors will allow us to prioritize wetlands for restoration efforts most effectively, and to also integrate the social aspects of this. So the ability for wetlands to serve as a source of livelihood, to serve as a function for clean air and water, and the socioeconomic benefits of these. So our goal is to develop a framework and guideline for incorporating coastal wetland restoration into long-term adaptation and develop plans to combat climate change, while also considering the sociological aspects such as the co-benefits for humans and the environmental justice perspectives. So we have 4 goals. To start by quantifying the net carbon sequestration using field observations and eddy covariance data. To assess the carbon sequestration capacity of these ecosystems, but also the other ecosystem services that they provide. Then, once we've done that, to develop policy and framework for restoration design and to make recommendations on how to prioritize restoration for these ecosystems, and then to be able to upscale this project to predict out into the future and model the influence of things like changes to wetland management, changes in climate, to the carbon sequestration potential, so that we can understand what would happen if the sea level were to rise, what would happen if we were to reach 2 degrees Celsius, what would happen if you changed the hydrology of an ecosystem and you flooded a wetland, how much carbon would you lose or gain through modeling. So this is a large project that has field sites in the California Delta, in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, the San Francisco Bay Delta, in the South Bay Salt Ponds, and in the Elkhorn Slough, which is just about 20 minutes north of us. Has anyone ever gone kayaking there? Yeah. Well, you guys might have seen our towers, which are out there. So this is what a lot of our equipment looks like, these like scaffolding towers, which we put out in the slough. These measure carbon dioxide and methane exchanging vertically, so what's coming down, what's going up. But we also have a lot of other stuff going on. I work on the surface water, so I'm collecting a lot of water samples. People are collecting soil samples, vegetation samples. We spend a lot of time in the mud and getting stuck in the mud. But overall, we are a couple years into this project, and so we are basically in the lab analysis stage of this right now. But our fieldwork involves monitoring the vertical fluxes through eddy covariance towers, which I'll talk about on the next slide what they are. Subsurface and surface water samples, so collecting soil cores and collecting surface water, and installing sensor information, or installing sensor instruments. in the lab analysis, which I spend a lot of time on, taking back our soil and our water samples and analyzing it for a lot of different geochemical parameters, the different types of carbon that you might find in it. I do a lot of work studying the nutrients that we might find in it to also look at potential nutrient contamination in the slough, and to understand the underlying processes that are driving carbon sequestration. So for instance, the microbial processes that might convert carbon back into CO2, which is not stable and a greenhouse gas, or into alkalinity, which is likely to be sequestered in the ocean and would also help buffer against ocean acidification. Going forward, we are going to be taking all of this data and using it to create a net carbon budget for the entire ecosystem. And then once we combine with our other 2 field sites in the San Francisco and Sacramento bays, we are hoping to upscale to statewide wetlands and be able to provide some information on the climate impacts and what would happen to these ecosystems if we were to restore or further degrade them. So our eddy covariance towers we have 5 of these set up around the slough. But these are a measurement of the CO2 and the methane that are emitted from the marshes. So we have these sensors. They are up on the scaffolding so that we can put them about 2 meters, 3 meters above where the vegetation is to get a larger footprint and be able to measure a representative area of the marsh. So if you have these towers in a forest, you also do it a couple meters above the vegetation. So in a forest, that can mean 50 meters up. But we're lucky we work in a marsh, so all of our vegetation is only about a foot high. So we didn't need to build them that tall. But it measures the vertical wind velocity and the concentrations of these greenhouse gases. And we use this to tell where carbon is moving and how much of it is being sequestered by our ecosystem, and generate stuff like this. So this is an example from some of our other sites up in the South Bay. So this is looking at the CO2 carbon flux of a couple of different ecosystems and the methane emissions. So methane and any other greenhouse gas, we convert it into a carbon dioxide equivalent because they have different warming potentials. So you would take methane and convert that to how much global warming it would cause if it were CO2. And that's how we get our total greenhouse gas budget. So that's CO2 equivalents per meter squared per year. So in this case, in Mayberry, we show that our carbon dioxide is always negative. We are always sequestering carbon, but we are always emitting methane. But over the course of a year, and it changes, and it has changed as this ecosystem has become less degraded and people have put work into restoring it. The net, once you combine those two, the methane emissions and the carbon dioxide sequestration, you go from being a carbon source in up until 2016 to being a carbon sink up until 2022. And then this is a similar example from Dutch Slough, which is another site in the South Bay, looking at the net ecosystem exchange. So that is the total carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent, and then the methane emissions. So this is why it's really important to have an accurate accounting of all of the greenhouse gases, because these ecosystems can look really different and they do emit some greenhouse gases. And so you need to know what is your total carbon dioxide sequestration and what is your total methane or other greenhouse gases being emitted by the ecosystem. But generally we find that tidal marshes or salt marshes compared to freshwater are much more effective at sequestering carbon because they emit a little bit less methane compared to a freshwater marsh. So the Elkhorn Slough, which I think a lot of you are familiar with, is just a little bit north of us here in the bay. It is the second largest estuary in California, and it's got a lot of different mixed land use types around it, so mostly agricultural, but also some like mild urban development. But And in the past, it's had a lot of hydrological changes. Most of you have probably seen the train tracks that run through it. That has created some issues with land subsidence, so that train track cut off the water supply in some areas for a long time, where they were then drained for agricultural purposes, and then they put the water back, but a bit like a sponge, or I guess not like a sponge really. If you dry out the land and then you pour water back onto it, unlike a sponge, it doesn't reabsorb and re-expand. Instead, you still have less land because it's kind of shrunk up and shriveled up, and then now there's water sitting on top of it. So this area where it is vegetated is almost entirely pickleweed and a little bit of salt marsh sandspurry. We have 5 eddy covariance towers around it. We also have lateral flux stations, which look at surface water. And we are doing a lot of work in a restoration project in Hester Marsh, which was completed about 5 years ago, which has been an amazing opportunity to see every year how restoration is changing the ecosystem. So our sites go all the way up the main channel, starting with the uppermost one, Porter Marsh. It's an impounded site. Its hydrology is entirely managed by the county. So when it is flooded, it's flooded artificially through a tide gate, but for the most part, it's very healthy. It's got a really dense cover of pickleweed, and it's doing really well. Then we have a freshwater marsh, which is a little bit outside of the main slough, but its water exports to the slough. This is its own very interesting project looking at the benefits, some of the other benefits of marshes. So it's in an agricultural area. The marsh was created entirely artificially with the goal that you would filter agricultural wastewater through this marsh, and the water that comes out on the other side is much, much cleaner. And we've found that it's been super successful at reducing this nutrient contamination that's in the agricultural water. And then this is our restoration project. These 3 sites act as a natural space for time study. So when you can't examine something over time because it would take too long, you examine 3 things that represent 3 different points in time simultaneously. So we have a mudflat. This one, like I said, has been in this situation where it was drained at some point, probably for agricultural purposes. When the water came back, the land didn't really reabsorb the water. Instead, you just have standing water over the whole thing and almost no vegetation. And then Hester Marsh, which is our restored site, you can see it's this sandy one over here. But 6 years ago, before the restoration project, Hester Marsh looked exactly like the mudflat. And so they came in with tractors and they carved out almost a whole hillside on the other side, and they completely coated it with sand. And then they came in with more tools and they dug out all of those channels using old aerial imagery of what the marsh originally looked like and completely remade it. So this picture is a little bit old. It's gotten slightly more vegetation, but you can see that the sediment is a little bit different and it's much less vegetated compared to its neighboring marsh, which is, you can kind of see it in the left side right next to it, Yampa Marsh, which is our pristine site. It's completely vegetated. It's had very little impacts from any type of degradation, any type of agriculture. And so the fact that these marshes are side by side provide an amazing opportunity to see, because they have almost identical influence in terms of rainfall, hydrology, other things that might affect your marshes, you can really see what are the effects of restoration. And for the most part, we see that they are really good. So this is our daily CO2 and our daily CO2 and methane from Yampa, Hester, and North. So for the most part, you can see that Yampa, when it's in the yellow, is a sink, much more so than Hester or North Marsh. But Hester looks a lot more like Yampa than it does to North. So Yampa is, again, our pristine site, our restored site, and our mudflat from left to right. And this is generally the effect that we are seeing for a mudflat. North is sequestering, it's still sequestering carbon a little bit. Yampa is sequestering a ton of carbon, and Hester, even though it is not very vegetated, it's like still working on becoming revegetated, is much, it's on its way, and it's moving really fast. 5 years is a really quick turnaround for us to get from to almost double the amount of carbon that it's sequestering. So there's still a couple of gaps in our research, and this is what myself and a lot of the other graduate students in our lab work on. So I work on the lateral fluxes. So these wetlands, when they sequester carbon in their soils, some of that carbon is moved out to the ocean when the tide comes in, and it gets flushed out and it goes out into the open ocean. But there's a lot of different species of carbon. You can have CO2, you can have carbon in the forms of like plants and animals, or you can have inorganic carbon in the form of alkalinity, bicarbonate, or carbonate. And we expect that all of those different species are going to look different, and they're going to be sequestered differently in the ocean. So if these lateral fluxes are exporting in the form of alkalinity, that might represent a lot of sequestered carbon that we're not currently including in our carbon budget. But if it's exporting in the form of CO2, maybe this is a potential source of carbon emissions that we haven't accounted for. So that's what I work on, and understanding that. But if we were to include these, and we had a better understanding of what species they're being exported as and what volume is being exported, and we were to include things like bicarbonate, which is likely to be sequestered, then it could be sequestering an extra 5 to 10 megatons of CO2 per year that is not previously accounted for. Then one of our other students works on the subsurface processes. So this is, like I said, the underlying microbial conditions and chemical processes that convert carbon into these different species. So going from your particulate organic carbon into your dissolved organic carbon into inorganic carbon or into methane, understanding like where does carbon become methane versus becoming bicarbonate and what is controlling for those factors is a really important thing for us to understand how we can restore these ecosystems effectively. If we can understand that underlying cause, maybe we know to restore a wetland where it is going to preferentially produce more bicarbonate than methane. So that looks like collecting a lot of muddy cores, and then the very painstaking process of drawing out all of the water in these cores through these little straws. And analyzing that for a lot of geochemical parameters. One of the other things that we are working on, and this is a project that is starting this year, is hotspots and hot moments. So CO2 is being produced, methane is being produced, but it's not being produced kind of at the same rate throughout the year all the time. Or always in the same place. So understanding we have these hot moments where like a lot of methane will get produced really quickly. And so understanding where is that happening and why is that happening is really important. So unlike our towers, which kind of look at a big general area, their whole footprint, we are putting in these collars, which are much smaller, maybe like that big, and we'll put those all around to see if we can try and capture these hot spots, hot moments, and then upscale that into understanding why and when do these occur. So I'm almost done, and then I think we have 10 minutes for questions. So this is kind of our big takeaways. We're still in the early stages of this project and working on upscaling this work, but right now we found that there is significant spatial and temporal variability in the ability or in the carbon sequestration potential of these ecosystems. So things like your land use history, your hydrology, your rainfall are all complicating our models and our ability to upscale. So we need to collect a lot more data in the field to understand. And for the most part, we're finding that we can model really effectively within a given marsh, but we're having trouble upscaling that to be representative of another marsh that has a really different ecosystem, even if it has the same vegetation. So, and then lateral flow is a really important missing component of these ecosystems. In some cases, this exported carbon can be up to 3 times as much as the carbon burial. So this is kind of a significant portion of the carbon budget that is missing. Then our conclusions: wetland restoration can have really significant effects on carbon burial and lateral carbon fluxes, and wetlands are capable of sequestering more carbon than was previously known. But in order to model this accurately, and especially because restoration projects are moving forward to being included in the carbon market and being in order to evaluate those accurately, we need to be able to provide an accurate greenhouse gas budget. And going forward into a hopefully decarbonized economy, nature-based solutions can play a significant role and will likely have to play a significant role. All right, thank you guys all for listening. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, in the blue shirt? Yeah.
Yeah, great talk.
Thank you.
I guess I was kind of curious about the methane component. So if you're like pristine down the
Mhm.
site, that seemed to have a lot less methane.
Yeah.
And I guess I just wonder why that is. Like I get the vegetation side, but why?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that we've gotten exactly there yet, so I can't tell you the processes, but my best guess is that something about Yampa is more effective at creating microbes that prefer to produce dissolved inorganic carbon rather than methane when they convert from dissolved organic into inorganic. And so that might be because they have evolved that way because Yampa has never been disturbed, or it might be because the microbes that there's not actually almost any microbial activity in our restored site because it was a freshwater, like sandy soil that came in, and then when it got like salinized, everything died, so it has very little microbes, but maybe the ones there are more effective at creating methane.
And it looked like at your various sites, you were able to like
Yeah.
restore that and create that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's looking like restoration is also having an effect on the methane production of these ecosystems. You want to go ahead? Mhm. They look really different. So we selected these sites because they have such different land use histories that we wanted to do this comparative experiment. But we do have some sites like our impounded marsh vegetation looks really similar to Yampa marsh, and we're finding that these two are similar to each other. They can be used, not interchangeably necessarily, but they are more similar to each other, but for the most part, we would combine all of this data to upscale it to get a net for the entire Elkhorn Slough. Go ahead. I don't think the name does not sound familiar, but I'm not 100% sure. Maybe, sorry, I've not made it to the South Bay field sites yet, but maybe next year. Not visually, no, I can't like see anything. We did recently launch a study looking into some of this. We happened to be out there about 4 days after the fire was like over and contained. So we collected a couple of different water samples to try and see if we might have captured some of the signal of the trace metals that were deposited. So when I say that we're not seeing anything, I mean like just with your eyes you're not seeing anything. But, and I don't think this is published yet, there are people who were out there a couple days later who did find really, really high concentrations of the trace metals that were associated with the fire all over the wetland. And so what we're doing going forward is trying to understand where are those metals moving, because my best guess is that they're not going to stay in the wetland. We found them on the very, very surface layer. So my expectation is that after a strong rainfall or a tidal event, probably a lot of that is going to get washed into the bay. But don't quote me on that. We are collecting vegetation samples, soil samples, water samples. We're collecting at different depths and on the surface to try and cast a wide net and see like are these metals sticking around in the slough? Are they getting taken up by plants? Might they get eaten by animals down the line? Or are they not there at all? And they're all probably in the ocean if they're not there. But they were definitely there right after the fire. Sure.
So would it be correct to say that, it's general knowledge that forests like the Amazon capture carbon that get polluted? Can we say wetlands first? Another sort of state like the Amazon forest?
Yeah, better than the Amazon forest, by I think almost 30 times as effective as the Amazon forest or a tropical rainforest at sequestering carbon.
Go around and say, save the wetlands.
Yeah. Yeah, ideally all of them. Yeah, go ahead. Mhm. Yeah.
So, do you have any recommendations for what we can do as citizens to help advocate and support restoration projects like this?
Vote for good policy. I would say that the main takeaway would be that restoration is excellent, but when you can protect a wetland, it's more effective, much, much more effective to protect a wetland to begin with than it is to restore a wetland after the fact. But yeah, engage with your local wetland ecosystems. Go visit the slough. They make, their money, and they can prove that they're providing these social aspects of the wetlands that can sometimes play a big role in like where the money goes. So I'd say engage with your wetlands and vote for good policy. Any other questions? Sure.
All this really impressive work, how much, in terms of funding, state and federal funding, how reliably?
Very. Yeah, this was primarily state funded for a lot of this work, but yeah, we definitely have a lot of federal funding, and we've lost federal funding recently. I can't speak to any of the specifics of like that, but yeah, federal funding is hugely important for this type of research and for these type of restoration projects. Initially, I took this off of the slide because it's no longer true, but a lot of the push to restore these ecosystems was coming from a federal effort to conserve America's like waterways and ecosystems. Thank you so much, everyone.